Was F1's surprising late Singapore Grand Prix controversy just a token farewell gesture or an act of intentional manipulation by one team to help its master? When Daniel Ricciardo made a late third pit stop in what may turn out to be his final F1 race, which was already a lost cause, it was widely interpreted as being done to try to aid Max Verstappen's title defence. But Ricciardo is not Verstappen's direct teammate, so if this was the RB team giving an assist to Red Bull Racing by denying McLaren's Lando Norris the fastest lap bonus point, is that fair? Despite all the noise about the RB team trying to be less of a Red Bull B team and carving out its own identity within F1, it remains effectively a Red Bull B team with an identity and ownership that is directly connected. And it would be naive to pretend that assisting the other Red Bull team played absolutely zero part in either RB or Ricciardo's thinking at the end of the race. Ricciardo literally admitted he was aware of the significance of taking a point away from Verstappen's title rival. He joked afterwards he'd heard something about a $3.5 million bonus for fastest lap and says he's guaranteed himself a very nice Christmas present if Verstappen wins the title by 1 point. But you'd need a hell of a convincing bank of evidence to prove that wasn't just a happy side benefit and what Ricciardo and RB did wasn't really just fairly standard competitive practice. It's not the first time a team has done that this year. We were actually surprised when someone presented us with a list of just how many times a team outside of the points has gone for fastest lap. Kevin Magnussen even tried to do it in this race for Haas, but his lap was deleted for track limits. So it's pretty commonplace for teams to go for the fastest lap even if they won't get the bonus point. It turns out there is actually an appetite for grabbing a micro honour and denying another driver and team in the process. And if Red Bull had done it with its own team, as was apparently being discussed with Sergio Perez until Ricciardo and RB did it, nobody would really have batted an eyelid. But obviously it's a lot more noticeable and controversial when another team owned by the same entity does it and directly assists the team they share ownership with in the process. Especially when the public reasoning seems quite unconvincing. Ricciardo said he had an idea that it would help Red Bull and Verstappen, but that he thought RB was just letting him have some fun given he was racing for nothing. And his team boss Laura Mekies claimed that as this might have been Ricciardo's last race, we wanted to give him the chance to savour it and go out with the fastest lap. That's a sweet gesture. Give Ricciardo a token fastest lap that means nothing because anyone can have it if they put softs on right at the end of a Grand Prix, and add a dash of controversy that could detract from the potential farewell you're supposedly trying to acknowledge. Cynicism aside, yes, it's a little convenient, but obviously we don't know the true motivation. And who's to say it wasn't a bit of both, that they knew it would be helpful to the other Red Bull team, but primarily there was nothing left to lose, so why not grab a bit of low-level glory? We'll probably never know if this was a spontaneous bit of intuition on the part of RB management, or a pre-agreed thing that will always happen if the situation allows, or simply a happy byproduct of the team's desire to give Ricciardo something to remember from what could be his last race. But this is really about a bigger issue than one specific example of a seemingly low-stakes fastest lap point. The point itself is almost certainly going to be irrelevant, even though it carries some mathematical significance at this stage of the season. As Norris lost that point, it is now possible for Verstappen to finish second in every single Grand Prix and sprint race and be world champion. So you may argue that RB has just performed an act that has a tangible impact on the championship situation. That means the result of the race itself was influenced in a small way, and it has some bearing on the wider championship too. If you were feeling bold enough to challenge this, you might argue that this therefore contravenes the FIA's International Sporting Code. The ISC prohibits any infringement of the principles of fairness in competition, behaviour in an unsportsmanlike manner, or attempt to influence the result of a competition in a way that is contrary to sporting ethics. But as we just mentioned, it's very hard, if not impossible, to prove the true motivation, and McLaren is basically willing to give the Red Bull teams the benefit of the doubt on this specific occasion, although it has flagged a much wider problem, which we'll get into in a moment. When we asked McLaren boss Andrea Stella after the race whether such a tactic potentially breaches the FIA code, he just said talk about sportsmanship would be out of place. The FIA didn't look into it and McLaren didn't protest, so there was nothing to be done here, which everyone needs to accept even if they don't agree with it. But there is an interesting point to consider simply because that ISC wording exists. Clearly, the rules about unsportsmanlike conduct or unfairly influencing the result of a competition are designed to prohibit big ticket offences. It might therefore amuse you, or irritate you depending on where you stand, that Norris actually got punished under this rule last year in Canada. That was for the grand infringement of backing up other cars before a pit stop under the safety car to make room for his teammate pitting ahead. That was actually standard competitive practice, and many thought punishing that was ridiculous at the time. It certainly felt very heavy-handed to invoke such a serious rule when it's designed to police much more serious matters. McLaren hasn't actually cited that itself, but we think it's at least semi-relevant because it shows that officials are willing to protect sporting ethics. And while giving competitors the benefit of the doubt is basically the deal F1 and the FIA have made by allowing Red Bull to own two teams, the bigger picture contains a bigger problem. While it may be argued that sporting ethics have never been F1's top priority because a team's aim is to do anything within the rules that helps it win, the key thing is that it does that to help itself, not someone else. Certainly not another team that, thanks to shared ownership, it is more likely to be accused of colluding with. And it is a clear example of the A-B team relationship that McLaren Racing CEO Zak Brown detests so much and has been banging the drum against for a long time now. There's no rule banning two teams being owned by a single entity, just as there's no rule that specifically forbids one of those teams deliberately targeting fastest lap to aid the other in the championship. Even if you might interpret the FIA code that way, it is not so explicit. Stella even said after the race that we just have to work harder to make sure this doesn't come down to a point. Even though he clearly had his suspicions about what happened, citing his surprise that RB's highest priority was to pointlessly score fastest lap at the end and calling it a little peculiar, Stella was trying to play fair. But he and Brown will inevitably use this to revive McLaren's long-held concerns about one entity ultimately owning two teams. Brown's been vocal about A-B arrangements and shared ownership for a very long time now and repeatedly urged the FIA to address this in the rules, but now his team is actually in a championship fight against the organisation it's got a problem with. Stella pointed out this is a Constructors' Championship, a Drivers' Championship, it is not a coalition championship, and said the issue of all 10 F1 teams behaving in a totally autonomous manner is something that needs to be definitely addressed. The answer here is not to force Red Bull to sell one of its teams. F1 and the FIA were very happy to rely on Red Bull co-founder Dietrich Mateschitz' enthusiasm and willingness to spend big when purchasing Minardi to turn it into Toro Rosso, the forerunner to what is now RB. That team now employs hundreds of people, has attracted big partners, and is a competitive entity in its own right. We think the right solution is to write something into the next Concord agreement prohibiting multi-team ownership in the future. Red Bull can be grandfathered into the arrangement for now, allowing Red Bull Racing and RB to coexist under that same umbrella, while gently being encouraged and incentivized to sell in the meantime. Forcing a sale would drive the price down massively, so that is a non-starter. But something a bit more subtle, like trying to bring Red Bull into conversations with the ambitious General Motors-backed Andretti project, for example, would result in a favourable outcome for everybody. The quick fix to avoid a specific repeat of what happened in Singapore, though, is just get rid of a truly rubbish rule. F1's fastest lap bonus point was reintroduced in 2019. The rationale was to create another talking point and encourage drivers to take risks, particularly late in races. But the flaws in the rule were immediately apparent, so to stop groups of stragglers turning the latter stages of races into their own farcical mini-qualifying sessions in pursuit of a point because they couldn't score one on merit, the rule makers added the proviso that you could only get the point if you finished in the top 10. That solved one problem, but not another, that the fastest lap has become meaningless in modern F1. High degradation tyres mean that it's often only available to those making late pit stops for a quick lap on fresh rubber and low fuel. So let's say you are leading the race by a small margin after a brilliant drive. Well, sorry, you can't go for that point. Whereas your slow teammate, who might be chugging irrelevantly round in 6th, way clear of the midfield, can take a free pit stop and take an easy fastest lap. That doesn't always happen, but it often does. The driver must still punch in a lap time, but these are rarely particularly impressive. Ricciardo's fastest lap in Singapore was 3.4 seconds slower than what he did in qualifying, so it was hardly an all-out special. With no position to race for, he not only had the luxury of fresh tyres and low fuel, but could also maximise the hybrid deployment. For a driver of his calibre, in a car of that pace, it was more a cruise and collect point than a fastest lap. And often such laps take a point off a driver who might have set an impressive time in a real racing situation that required more skill. The bottom line is, the fastest lap is so often circumstantial. While the point is heavily biased towards the higher finishing positions, taken 70 times out of 122 by top 3 finishes, the fact that fastest laps have been taken by drivers finishing in every position down to 18th shows how disconnected it can be from performance. The point hasn't even been awarded on 14 occasions, 13 times because they weren't accompanied by top 10 finishes, and once because of the farcical non-race at Spa in 2021. Points recognise achievement in F1, but the fastest lap bonus is very often a random triviality ill-befitting a genuine sporting competition. And as was feared to be the case in Singapore, it can potentially be manipulated as an act of interference into something that matters a lot more.